Hello and welcome to the Women Writers Festival presented by She the People. It is our absolute pleasure to be bringing authors from all over the world. Our virtual sessions have made this possible, and it's been such a diverse journey through today, bringing authors, economists, writers, script writers all together on what is clearly the world's largest Women Writers Festival. And now I could say traveling Women Writers Festival. I've got three fantastic authors joining me from different parts of the world. I've got Pallavi Aiyar from Madrid, who has recently written The Thousand Cranes and is already got her next book coming out, The Jakarta Tales. She, of course, is an intrepid traveler and has written a diverse number of books, and we'll talk to her about that. Jenny Bhatt is joining us from Dallas. Each of Us Killers is her latest one. She also does the Desi Books podcast and has looked at translations in a big way as well. Thanks very much, Jenny, for joining us. And Rituparna Chatterjee, who's literally braving a very early morning for us here at Women Writers Festival, has got The Water Phoenix out and takes us through how her process of writing has evolved over the last many years of being an author. So thank you, three of you, for being with us. Pallavi, I'll start with you.
Sure.
The subject of this conversation is the writers of the diaspora. And that's really what I want to pick. As somebody who has been traveling different parts of the world and including all those travels in some way or the other in your writing, how much of you is the woman who, is from India, saw her piece come through as an author, a journalist, and now travels the world and brings a piece into it? How has that journey shaped for you?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think diasporic writing or writing outside of India as an Indian is obviously writing of two worlds, just as the author themselves happen to be. They happen to have one foot in two different worlds. The concerns are therefore dual, perhaps multiple, addressing at least two different audiences simultaneously. In my case, this is quite obvious. In nonfiction, and I primarily write nonfiction, narrative nonfiction, I write as a kind of Indian observer of other countries. And the things that intrigue me, the reactions I have to what I see, any resonance or dissonance that I record, all of this has to do with my being Indian. But what I am writing about is somewhere else. And in a way, it's like holding up a mirror to Indians as I try and write about the world. But because I have lived in and worked from multiple countries, my perspective is not just dual, but multiple. So when I write, for example, about Japan, it is not only as an Indian, but as an Indian who knows China, Indonesia, Europe. And I feel that through the process of traveling and writing about different parts of the world, it has also been a process of acquiring a kind of multiplicity of perspectives. And I think this is evident in other diasporic writing too. A Ghanaian Indian living in the UK, a Malaysian Chinese in the US. We're not just hyphenated, but I think we are often re-hyphenated several times over. If you sort of look at a sense of identity to my writing, I would say it is this multiplicity of perspectives, the ability to have and to convey different ways of seeing and being in the world simultaneously.
Jenny, if I can put the question to you about, do you think that women writers of the diaspora have an independent identity? Or do you think actually the very idea of them being across cultures takes away from that independent identity and gives them multiple identities?
I think it depends on context, where you are. I think, I left India at 18. I went to the UK, I studied there, I moved around, I worked in Germany, Scotland, and then I did various parts of the US. And I think it depends on the context of where you are, where, a platform like this, for example, I'm seen as somebody with multiple identities because I do write about India and I go back and forth between India and other countries, right? So I travel a lot to India. So I think the multiplicity of perspectives that Pallavi mentioned, for sure it's there, but I think how we are perceived, which is your question, are we perceived as people who can speak from these perspectives? And I think that's more tricky question. It's a good question. It's a tricky question because yes, I feel like I'm writing from all these different perspectives too, but how is it perceived? Now, I happen to be a book reviewer too. And one of the interesting things I find when I'm pitching book reviews to editors at NPR or Washington Post, and I have to sort of justify why I've chosen a certain book to review and what I can bring to it, right? And I try to explain, okay, you know, this is a book by a writer of Indian origin. I happen to have that background as well as having lived in the West for so long. So it's interesting how that's all perceived. You know, it's almost like I have to justify it every time, even though everything I've ever written in my own fiction, all my characters, all my protagonists happen to be Indian. They don't all live in India, but they all happen to be Indian culture and Indianness, if you like. However we define it, because there are many definitions of Indianness, however we define it, it exists even in the diaspora, whether you're living in Australia as an Indian or you're living in Germany. So I think it really does depend on who you're talking to, who that person is, because you may feel you've got the perspectives and the multiplicity, but you have to, I feel like I've had to justify it a lot, you know, so.
As you said, that it's a lot about who you are and what you've gone through. Now, Rituparna, you've just wrapped up what is quite a candid and moving memoir. While you were writing that, you know, how are you perceiving your journeys through both writing as well as just meeting people, and especially since you've been living in, you know, San Francisco? What aspect of your writing did you think has ever got impacted by where you are and the cultures that you're part of as a writer of the diaspora?
Right. I lost out on the last part you said. Hello.
No, I was just saying, as an extension of what we're discussing, the authors of the diaspora, as an author of the diaspora.
So just a bit of history to go back. When I was, I think, 18, 17, I was fascinated by the writers of the diaspora, Amitav Ghosh, Jhumpa Lahiri, because there was a deep sense of isolation. Funnily enough, when I came to the Bay Area about 14 years ago, I could not relate to that anymore. And it seems to have come full circle to have grown up on a diet of diasporic fiction and to suddenly, you know, be a diasporic author yourself. What ties almost all diasporic fiction is, like Pallavi said, the observer, but also a deep sense of isolation. I'm talking about fiction because my memoir reads very much like fiction. That was the original plan before people said, no, it cannot be autofiction, it needs to be memoir. So it has been a heavy influence on me because of this sense of not belonging anywhere. And today it's a lot more common. You know, the term is immigrant, but that makes you have a razor sharp gaze on what's happening. I also write a column, California Dreaming, for the Economic Times on my life as an immigrant mother. And I guess that ties up because I'm able to observe what are very normal things here, shooter drills for kindergartners. It's just scandalous. 5-year-olds protecting themselves. I don't think that lens on America could have come had I not been of this origin. And it's actually not so sad. It's fantastic to never belong. It's the greatest gift you can have as a writer. It's a lot more than a tourist because you do not have, you know, rose-colored glasses on. You are able to observe and you're able to also be very empathetic, because going forward, I'm a bit tired of memoir, 2 memoirs, a memoirish column. I only want to get to fiction. Never planned at all. So it really helps, this lens of, you know, not belonging and having a very compassionate perspective, if you will. And like I said, I grew up on a diet of, you know, Amitav Ghosh, Salman Rushdie, Jhumpa Lahiri, all of them.
Yeah.
So.
Pallavi, there's been a decent amount of flow of books that are written with Indians in America, Indians in the British context. But as somebody who has been spending a lot of time in Japan and Indonesia and various other countries, do you think there is more of that diasporic experience yet to come out in mainstream writing?
No, absolutely. I do think that, a lot of what we have traditionally seen as diasporic writing, immigrant writing, firstly, it's been conflated with immigrant writing, whereas, for what the kind of writing I do is not immigrant writing. It is travel writing, really, more than immigrant writing. And therefore, that sense of loss and of not belonging and displacement is not the primary concern of it. It's not about the scent of an imagined homeland and pickled mangoes and, a lot of that we have seen in writing that has come out of diasporas in the US, for example. I think it was both Rituparna and Jenny raised very important points, because I think a lot of this is about where the center of writing is, or publishing is, and who our intended audiences are. Because if you kind of are essentially writing for the sort of book capitals of the world in London and New York, and your intended audiences are there, then perforce you end up writing in a certain way and you are perceived in a certain way. For me, my audience, my imagined audience has I haven't really had one, but if I did have one, it would be Indian, because that's kind of my internal monologue. It has never been the sort of Western reader, and I've mostly been published in India. And therefore, what I'm writing about and how I'm perceived, I think, is quite different to if I were diasporic in the sense of actually being somewhere else and writing about my home country for this other audience. And, for me, very much the journey has not really been about not belonging anywhere, but this kind of attempt to belong everywhere. And what I was talking about, the multiple identities, that sort of acquiring an expansiveness and capaciousness that would allow me to write about wherever I am and not feel constrained about writing about my experience and my history, and sort of broadening beyond that and being able to write about other parts of the world just as an observer, just like we have had Western writers with great authority writing about wherever they happen to be. Americans can write about China, they can write about India, they don't have to write about America or being American. And I think that we are gradually seeing a shift as well. We've seen some writing coming out by Indian writers about non-Western parts of the world and non-immigrant experiences. We've had Anjum Sundaram write about the Congo, for example. He wrote a book called Stringer. We had Rahul Bhattacharya, I think, write about Guyana. So it's still obviously in its infancy. It's not something that's widespread. And I have had that problem. I wrote a book about Europe called Punjabi Parmesan, which was published in India. It was published in America under the title of New Old World. It was not published in Europe. And often the reason that was given by various publishers were that, but you're Indian, why would you write about Europe? Europeans have Europeans to write about Europe, and they're not that interested in hearing what an Indian has to say. At that point, I suddenly became very Indian, like my Indianness got center stage. So yeah, it was interesting. In America, that didn't seem to be as much of a problem as it was in Europe, which was the subject of the book. Yes, I mean, we are I think, though, hopefully moving towards a multiplicity of production centers and distribution centers, and the way in which knowledge is conceived of and produced, I hope, is diversifying. Ultimately, you have to also move beyond people like me and say, look at people like my children. My kids are half Spanish, half Indian. One was born in China, one was born in Brussels, and they grew up in Indonesia and Japan. So if they were to write, what kind of diaspora would they represent? What would be the diaspora? What would be that kind of imagined route that they would talk about? I don't know. So it's becoming more complex, I think, today than it was 20 years ago. And a lot of the diasporic writing that we grew up on, which was very much going back to what I said at the beginning, the pickled mangoes and the smell of my mother cooking and cumin leaping on the talka of dal and so on.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Jenny, I'm just trying to see that when you look at this time around, for example, each of us killers got a very wide set of publicity in the United States. Does that also reflect, to take away from what Pallavi was talking about, the diversity and the plurality of, the kind of reading that most people are beginning to do. Increasingly, I feel like in India right now, we've got massive exposure to books that are coming not just from Indian authors, but a large number of authors overseas, and a lot is being read. And I'm wondering if you, as an Indian author, are feeling the same about, for example, American reading, American bookstores, and the kind of interest, let's say, American media publications have in your book right now. Do you feel there's been slight sort of interest of going towards diverse authors in a bigger way than before in the United States?
Well, there's certainly a big push in the last few years. Big organizations like even the National Book Foundation that gives out the National Book Award in the US, they've all been pushing for more diverse literature, right? But I will say a couple of things about in terms of reception. The first thing was that I first submitted this book, Each of Us Killers, which is a short story collection, to a lot of US publishers, right? And the feedback I got was the writing is great, but we can't sell short story collections, especially debut writers. So, could you do something else? And we're happy to look at a novel. And I said, well, this is what I have now. And I got pretty much similar feedback, Shaili, even in India with Indian publishers. They were like, we love it, but short story collections don't sell. So I think diversity can sometimes become, or the call for diversity sometimes becomes performative, because I do see American writers with short story collections, debut collections doing well. So I do sometimes wonder, what are you really telling me? What's the subtext here, right? So that's one thing. Now, in terms of reception, you are right that Each of Us Killers did, knock on wood, get decent reception in the US. I think a lot of it had to do, quite frankly, with a lot of hustling, albeit, let's be honest, we've all done a lot of hustling for books, and I had to, I've done like 20 plus interviews, I've, worked hard with events and stuff. So a lot of it has to do with getting the word out. I don't think that if I hadn't worked to do that, I don't necessarily think, because my book is with a small publisher. It's not with a Knopf or a HarperCollins or a Penguin Random House in the US, right? Because they wouldn't take that on. I will tell you that despite all the push for diversity, and one of the reasons I started my podcast, Desi Books, is that there is still this single story approach where they'll get one or two big books from Indian diasporic writers, and that's it. They've got their South Asian novel of the year. Rituparna was talking about Jhumpa Lahiri and Amitav Ghosh, and you look at. I also read a lot of those writers, and it was for a long time. It was, if a publishing house had one or two writers with those, one or two writers like that, they chose to continue publishing those. The seat at the table was not available. The table wasn't made bigger. People forget that South Asia is such a vast region. And it's not just India, it's the whole South Asia, because we have shared history. So I feel like, yes, there's been a lot of improvement with diversity-led initiatives. A lot of it has focused on bringing writers who are, African American, Black, Hispanic, and that's all been good. I think it's all necessary. But I will say that when it comes to Indian writers, often we get left out of the Asian label, because when you say Asian, people think it's East Asian, Chinese, Japanese, whatever, and you get left out of the white and the mainstream, and we the South Asian becomes invisible. South Asian becomes this kind of, where are we? In America, I'm talking about America, right? I think UK is a little better in that respect than America is. But in America, I do feel sometimes that the diversity talk tends to be performative, and they get their one book about extremism or religious fundamentalism, or terrorism or slums from India, and that's it, because that confirms the stereotypes and tropes that we know. I'm talking about fiction now, I'm not talking nonfiction, but with fiction, there are still a lot of stereotypes and tropes, and Pallavi mentioned a couple of those. There's the spices and the mangoes, but there's also slums, there's terrorism, arranged marriage, and if you're checking those boxes, you got a seat at the table. If you're not checking those boxes, it's a harder uphill struggle. So there we are.
Rituparna, do you have a similar view on it? Where are you on this?
Absolutely, a little bit more so. My US agent has asked me, Alice in Wonderland is such a big part of your book. Why don't you make an Indian version of it? So when Pallavi talked about cumin and all of that, we have evolved from that into a whole new label of exotic. And with all due respect, the people who are calling the shots are white, mostly. They have no understanding. One hopes that Kamala Harris's election will change the American perspective. After 14 years here, I'm still asked if I speak Hindu, if I eat Hindu. Jenny can totally relate. I'm sorry, but we feel very alienated. And yeah, people often ask, oh, are you a feather Indian? Are you a dot Indian? This is so racist, but it's coming from a place of such innocence, and that, you cannot even get upset. This is just one thing I'm totally not missing in, the age of quarantine, all this nonsense, stuff like, oh, you speak really good English except for your accent. I'm talking about the Bay Area. You've been here, Shaili, you know just how many Indians are here. Unless you're in the bubble of academia, or certain, like, this is mainstream America. I am honestly too scared to move to even real America, even though it's so expensive living here, for that reason. And it reflects in the publishing choices. I have had trouble getting a whole bunch of books out. And like I said, that's what my agent suggested. I think the UK is a lot more open. The fact that so many Booker nominees happen to be Indian writers. Let's look at Apu Joshi's Burnt Sugar. She's an American citizen. Her book was rejected in America, then got published in India, then it got picked up by a European agency, and it's been shortlisted for the Booker. I'm sorry, but that's like a slap on the face of US publishing, because, and I'm not going to sugarcoat this because I'm quite furious about it. Readers are ready, we are ready, our publisher is ready. The people who are, and like Pallavi said about her children, the whole notion of what is a country, what is identity, what is belonging is often going to be something we'll have to choose ourselves, make for ourselves as we grow. It's very common for people in one family to have, different passports, different countries. Where does that even leave this issue? So it's a complicated issue, and the token Jhumpa Lahiri, Amitav Ghosh, one a year doesn't work. However, there are a lot of indie presses that are coming out that are doing great work. There are different stories. Devi Laskar's, I think Jenny knows her, brilliant book, The Atlas of Reds and Blues, about her own experience, with gun violence and the American police. I'm not going to get any more into that. It's just, well, it is what it is. But it was published by a small press. However, it was published by big publishers in the UK, in India. So the distribution is different. Small presses are good, but we need more in the mainstream. Even the narratives that are coming out, there was some Indian reality TV show. It was so ghastly. I couldn't even bear to watch.
The marriage. Yeah, the marriage matchmaker.
No, but that's out of India. There's one here on Bravo. I think I haven't owned a TV for 20 years, but I have no idea of the channel. But it was for Bravo. It was very much, I think it was like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, but with an Indian American family, I think in Florida.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to say, they have really, their own notions. And this is a loss to readers. It is a loss to writers. Everybody's ready. It's just like our Hindi movies, dumb down the audience. The audience is a lot more ready. And now you can see with stuff on Netflix and Amazon Prime. So it's about the ivory tower. They have built it themselves. And I have had a lot of struggle trying to get real stories. And again, my experience in diaspora has been, I work with kids. So I have had, I mentioned shooter drills. It's very painful. I've had kids be so traumatized because we are doing a drill, but there is PTSD on this. 5 and 6 year olds, these police just knocking very badly on the door. It's scary. And then they'll come and they're asked to run or hide or throw furniture even. This is mock. But they're 5-year-olds, they're not adults. I am still traumatized, but I've been for about 2 shooter drills now. And I'll have even white kids come in my lap, they don't know. So this is the new diaspora immigrant, if you will, story. And publishing isn't ready for it yet.
Yeah.
I think sort of the bottom line seems to be, as both you and Jenny pointed out, that seems like there's a lot out there that's worth reading, lots of people who want to read, and thanks to the kind of new, easy to access online digital platforms, there are opportunities. But now let me just sort of flip the coin and start with you, Pallavi. Given that this has been a pandemic, just like in the last a month so, 3 large publications in India, news publications in India have shut down. Know for a fact that many publishers for books are moving to ebooks and sort of reworking, rethinking how to approach publishing with authors. What are you preparing for, Pallavi, as a post-pandemic author scene?
A post-pandemic author scene. We knew all about postmodern, and now we have post-pandemic.
I know, seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think it's been worse for news media than it actually has been for the publishing world. In some ways, because of the boom in ebook sales and the kind of technologies that are becoming more widely available and are also there's an uptick in them. I mean, myself, I've been converted to the Kindle because I haven't been able to go to bookstores in the last several months. And I was one of those, holdouts, despite the fact that I had a ridiculous number of books and I moved countries quite often. I was actually carting my library around with me. But for about 6 months ago, I switched, and it's been really transformative. The fact that the moment somebody recommends a book to me, I sort of instantly buy it, and I don't have to wait for the next time I go to a bookstore and possibly forget what had been recommended and so on. And so I think we have actually seen a lot more sales of different kinds, both for ebooks and also just ease of ordering on online platforms. But, obviously, like everything else, the whole nature of work and the whole nature of how things are produced is changing, how they're distributing. There's going to be shifts in financial and power relations in the publishing industry, and that is definitely likely to have a trickle-down effect on writers as well. And, a lot of the time when we talk about writing, whether it's diasporic or not, ultimately we are talking in roundabout ways about these power relations and where the money is and where the money isn't. And it was interesting for me to listen to Jenny and Rituparna as well earlier, because they were talking a lot about being alienated and how the difficulties they have with this American publishing machine, which of course gives rise to the question of why do they really particularly want to be published in America when they can be published in other places as well. There is this sense still, though, because in America is actually where the big money is, and it would be much harder to be exclusively published in India, for example, where perhaps there is a greater appetite and a wider variety of things that they could write about and be accepted more easily. So, I think we also need to look at the business side quite a bit. And I think the pandemic has thrown some of that into sharp relief.
So, Jenny, for example, do you think that at this, during this period, you've thought of possibilities of self-publishing, etc.? I mean, I'm just also trying to think that in many ways, there are readers, of course, who will go and think of the publisher before they sort of, look at the book, etc. But I think there are now equal number of readers who just want a great story, right? They don't care where it comes from.
I'll tell you something. I do want to respond to a couple of things that Pallavi said. One is, I do think that post-pandemic, the publishing centers of power are going to change. It's not going to be just London and New York anymore. Even within the US, people are seeing that you don't have to be in New York to be a mover and shaker in the publishing world, because you can work remotely. So that's number one. Number two is about getting published. And I will tell you, I first shopped my book around, my short story collection around in India, because I was physically in India for the last 6 years. I only came here back here to the US in February 2020. So I've been shopping my book around there, and I was told by every Indian publisher, I went to everyone, okay? And I had an agent as well. I was working with an agent. So I was told, fiction doesn't sell very well. If you've got a translation, yes. If you've got nonfiction, yes. And within fiction, short story collections are a no-no if you're brand new, if it's your first book. So I will say that there's a lot of reckoning even in Indian publishing, to be honest, because what happens is once you get published in the US, then the Indian publishers want your book, which is ridiculous. It's like, okay, so my book wasn't good enough before and now it is. So, and I get it, it's a commercial decision, Shaili. It's about, okay, now the book has a name, so now they can sell it. But, so I don't think, for me personally, because I'm very attached to India, so I would love to have my books published there first. My translation book, which I wasn't even pitching, I had offers coming to me saying, hey, can you give us a Gujarati to English translation? And that was the book that they loved, and they published. HarperCollins India published it, right? But my short story collection, no. And then interestingly, the translation is also a short story collection. but it happens to be a well-known Gujarati writer. So I will say that there's a whole reckoning that needs to happen. Now, I don't know, given how diaspora writers are viewed in India, and rightly so in some cases, because of the way they write. Sometimes some of them write with these blinkered, they've left India, they haven't been back for 25 years, and all they remember is this nostalgia drenched memory of monsoons and spices and whatever, saris, and so we've had this, right? We've had this where they're exoticizing Indian culture in pandering to a Western gaze. And that's literally what, I've written and read a lot about this, let's not pander to the Western gaze. So for me, I do think there's a whole lot of reckoning that needs to happen. Now, to your question about would I self-publish, I personally wouldn't, because it's a lot of work. If you're going to do a good job with a book, and I don't want to put out shoddy work, and I am not qualified to be an editor, I am not qualified to be a distributor and a book designer, and I know you can go and hire all those services. I don't have the physical manpower to do that, personally, woman power to do that. So I'm not going to self-publish at this stage. That may change down the road. But I do think that both publishers in India and publishers in the US have to revisit how they're approaching, as I said, in the US, it's more about the danger of the single story. They take the one story about slums and the one story about terrorism or the one story about arranged marriage, and that is it. Like Rituparna said, Avni Doshi's book didn't fit any of those things, and so therefore it was rejected. Whereas there's a couple of books that really did the rounds and had huge publicity pushes this year, 2 novels, debut novels, in the US, happened to be about slums and terrorism, but they did really well. That's what happens. So I think that has to change. I think Indian publishers need to take seriously. Not all diaspora writers are going to be nostalgia drenched. Some of us are writing about, in my case, work-related stuff, which is nothing to do with nostalgia or slums or terrorism. Those are parts of the story, but not the focus of the story. So I mean, there's a lot of work to be done. And I hope that this pandemic has given pause to all of us, writers, editors, and everybody within the publishing ecosystem, has given pause for us to look at where we are all headed post-pandemic.
Sure. Okay, Rituparna, I want to, you may add to this conversation if you'd like, but I want to sort of pick the piece on writing itself. For you, how has the process of writing been? Did this pandemic pause you? Did it give you the opportunity to write incessantly? What kind of books are you working on, including an insight, a deeper insight than I gave at the start on the water phoenix?
Well, I'll just like to add to the post-pandemic, questions, because writing is such a solitary experience, especially for fiction or very, more memories like fiction. So the process is very, very immersive. It's not as research oriented, left brain logic, if you will. So we tend to think that we are alone. Everybody has been affected by the pandemic. We need to understand that publishing is no different. And there is actually an Indian author, Tanuj Solanki, who said that he self-published after, I think he's been nominated for a few awards. He's pretty well known in India, and he still chose to self-publish because it was so fast. He got his story out in, I don't know, few weeks, if I'm not mistaken, versus in publishing and how long it would take. So that's something to keep in mind. I don't think the pandemic is as much of a problem as the constraints the industry of publishing worldwide has put on itself. It's like, I'm thinking of a lot of Hindi idioms right now, but anyway. So basically, it needs to shift. It is centuries old, not much has changed. You may have ebooks and greater promotions, but the nature is the same. It's ridiculously slow in the age of Instagram. We have to see how people are consuming. We're competing with Netflix. We're competing with, Instagram posts. There's a lot of competition. That is a real issue, not pandemic. Secondly, coming to my writing, it has been, initially it was very good in the pandemic, but I have a small child and it's very difficult to get, full focus, and he's very emotionally demanding. So, and all the school stuff, and the alternative school I chose for him, which is why I was there at the shooter drills, and it's non-academia focused, has really made me question my choices in the pandemic, only because it doesn't let me write. My mental state is often decided on, did I get to write? Did I not get to write? It's literally on a day-to-day level. The next one that I'm working on is a novel. I think I don't know how much to say because it's still early days, but I know my agent is going to be very scandalized. And because it doesn't fit into any boxes. Some of it may appear too white. And if we keep thinking like this, we will never be able to write. The whole business of publishing marketing comes later. But I'm constantly talking about guns, guns, guns. It has really, I have not had a personal experience, but I've seen what it has done to children, even white American children. I've seen the kindest people say they want guns because they're so afraid of a militarized police. It does deal with the whole how gun culture seeps into day-to-day life. And how normal it is, and that's really quite horrific. So that political climate is definitely there. And again, these are very white terms, if you will. But hey, I've lived here for 14 years now, and of course, I'm in India all the time. My work is published in India. I was a foreign correspondent for the Economic Times, so I'm not in a cocoon here. I think we need that perspective very much. I feel as much alienated in India as I do here. And I don't mean it as a sob story. I mean it as a gift. It enables me to see things I never did when I grew up in India. It enables me to see things because I don't think I can ever fit into this, whatever it is, so much stuff happening. There's a church next to my house on which during the elections, it said kindness matters and Black Lives Matter pretty much together. And probably a kid, because it was written in a black Sharpie, all canceled out, and a lot of hate message for Black people. I will not repeat the expletives that were there. This is one of the safest places, New York, the Bay Area. You've been here, Shaili, you know what it's like, and Jenny, you've lived here too. And that really scares me. And I don't think electing Biden and Harris is going to change that, because this is part of this is part of who many people are, a big majority that, elect Trump. So we have to face our own shadows as society. And if I'm an Indian writer, a diasporic writer, does that mean I cannot write about what is my daily experience? Sorry, I'm not going to let publishing, marketing, and sales determine my life. I'm a very emotional writer. I've been, even my columns are deeply moving. I put all of myself into it. I have tried to fit into boxes and outlines, and because I come from a journalistic background, very logical, and I saw why I failed miserably. I write sentence by sentence. I do not know what the next sentence is going to be. It's the most marvelous experience. No plot, no outline. Even with the memoir, I'm quite surprised by the end. What comes up, and that's how the current work was born. Yeah.
Thank you for pouring it all out. I mean, really, you've been so brutally honest with that expression. Pallavi, Thousand Cranes, and then now Jakarta Tales. Just a glimpse into those of us who are looking to pick books for Christmas, for example, what to expect, and what else is lined up. Are you back in Madrid? So does that tell us that the next book is going to be somewhere there?
Not really back in Madrid for the first time in my life. But I can't think of two books that are kind of more different than A Thousand Cranes for India, the subtitle of which is Reclaiming Plurality Amid Hatred, and Jakarta Tales. I think if you had to pick a Christmas book, maybe Jakarta Tales is more of a kind of treat. But A Thousand Cranes for India is a sort of very somber and painful book. It's an anthology. And it came out of an experience, well, not really an experience, a moment that I had about 2.5 years ago in April 2018, when I was in the Japanese city of Hiroshima in the south of Japan, and I was there visiting with my family, and I woke up that morning and looked at my phone, and the news that I read about from India had to do with an 8-year-old girl, Asifa Banu, a Kashmiri girl who had been kidnapped and confined in a temple and gang raped and drugged and eventually murdered. And in some ways, to be Indian is to be very inured to the worst kind of brutalities, because we have such a wellspring of them that on a daily basis you read about it. And my usual reaction to these is, kind of horror, but an almost comforting horror, because I also have a sense of that reaction being ephemeral, the sense that I will forget about it tomorrow and I will be able to move on with my life. But there was something, and I think many of us have had this. We've had an inflection point. We've had a moment which is like the straw that breaks the camel's back, and you just feel, okay, this is where it stops. I can't take it anymore. And I think Asifa Banu for me was that moment. And I felt like this dense weight descend upon me, and this sense of utter despair of where we had arrived at as a society, and feeling very sort of stripped of hope, and very stripped of, perhaps worst of all, as a writer, of words. I felt like I couldn't talk about it, and also very contaminated by it, very complicit in it, and I somehow couldn't find a distance from that event. I felt like this had happened on my watch, and I, as a result, was unable to really talk about it very much with anybody, not with my husband, obviously not with my boys. They were very young. And we spent that morning wandering around Hiroshima and looking at the Peace Park, which is a memorial that's been erected to the victims of the 1945 nuclear bomb, and trying to sort of distract myself. And looking at what had gone down there was not very comforting either. It was another example of extreme atrocities. We had something like 60 or 80,000 people die in the immediate aftermath of the bombing. And, several people, the heat had been so intense that people had literally been vaporized, they had evaporated. And as I was going through many grim exhibits that were reminders of what had happened in Hiroshima, I came across 2 origami paper cranes that were incredibly powerful to me. They were childlike, they were simple, but there was something in their beauty that refused the ugliness. And they had, of course, become very symbolic in Hiroshima. We had skeins of thousands, tens of thousands of paper cranes folded by children around the world that was sent into the city every year as a kind of symbol of healing, as a wish for peace, as a refusal of hatred. And the story in that had to do with a little girl called Sadako Sasaki, who had died in the aftermath of the Hiroshima bombing, 10 years later, of radiation-related leukemia. And there was a legend in Japan that if you fold 1,000 cranes, your wishes are heard. And this little girl was folding her cranes, but she died before she could complete it. And then the cranes took off, with people completing them for her and sending them into Japan. So, seeing those paper cranes, I sort of suddenly felt that wordlessness, that hopelessness that I had felt, I felt a spark and a sense that perhaps, there was something I could do, and perhaps the worst reaction was to sort of give up and feel felled by that hatred. I decided to do a kind of social media project initially, where I had people send me paper cranes as a way of reclaiming a sense of multiplicity and plurality, and refusing the ugliness of the India of Asifa Banu. And through that, the idea of this book was born. And I ended up having about 23 of India's very well-known writers across a wide variety of genres: short story writers, novelists, poets, polemicists, journalists, memoirists, and poets do pieces for me about different fault lines in India. But what connects all of them is the motif of the Japanese paper crane, which kind of pops up as an Easter egg in each piece in some way. So there's that. And then the Jakarta Tales, very quickly, is the continuing adventures of Soyabean and Tofu, who are 2 Chinese cats that began their adventures with a 2011 book called Chinese Whiskers, which was set in Beijing. These are cats that have gone from dustbin to diplomat. They were street cats, but got adopted by a diplomatic family, and therefore have adventures all around the world. And they tend to get involved in situations that tell us a little bit about the country. In China, it had to do with a coronavirus, but in that particular case, it was SARS, not the current coronavirus, in which pets were blamed and were being rounded up by vigilante gangs. And in Jakarta Tales, they get involved in a fake news network set during the time of Indonesian elections. I feel I'm taking up too much time, so we need to also move on to Jenny and Rituparna. So I will stop here. But as I said, two extremely different books.
Okay, Jenny and then Rituparna, about your books. Please make your pitch, because I really say that on the Women Writers Festival, the one thing we want people to know is what books you need to go out there and buy by women writers.
Okay, very quickly then. So this is my short story collection, Each of Us Killers. And it is, these are, I say it's the stories at the intersection of labor and our emotional lives. And these are people, all working people, from baker, a rickshaw driver, housemaid, an architect. And these are just stories about those very specific moments in their working lives that changed them. And so that book is out in the US, but it's also available in India on Kindle. And then my translation, which came out just after that, and this would probably make a better Christmas book than this one, because this one's a little more serious. But this is Gujarati pioneer of the short story form, Dhumketu, and he wrote about 600 short stories. And I read all of them, but I only translated 26 of them here. It was a labor of love, because this is twice the agreed upon manuscript size that I had agreed on with HarperCollins. But anyways, it's a beautiful set of stories that I feel are timeless, because he wrote a lot about caste, class, and gender issues. And I think those issues are still very much relevant, even in our times today. And so I think, what's interesting is a lot of the themes, I started this translation after I finished my own short stories, but I talk a lot about caste, class, and gender, and how that affects our work identities and workplace issues in here. And so, of course, this resonated with me when I was translating. So those are the two books.
True.
All right. So this is A Water Phoenix. It's just out. It is a memoir on healing from child sexual abuse in India. I think the latest stats are one child is abused every 15 minutes in India. And but this is not as dark a book as people think it is. A wonderful review just came out in the Daily O, which says it's for anybody who has ever felt hurt. It's about healing, that it's not a luxury, but it's important and it's possible. And it's as much about the wonder of childhood as much about the joy of it. This is a magic girl, and there's a magical creature, the water phoenix. It's got a ton of animals. It's about my adventures growing up all over India. At one point, I spoke 6 Indian languages because it's got monkeys, all of those typical exotic, if you will, but not dealt in that way. And there are love stories among stray dogs and all of which. But what goes on in the inner life of a child who is abused? How do you make sense of life when you grow up? How mental health issues just pop up? And we've touched a bit upon schizophrenia as well, along with the regular depression, panic attacks, etc. The Water Phoenix actually offers solutions. It's not just telling you there's a problem. And I think we need more of those. And I have been overwhelmed with the amount of people writing in, and many, many men. I hope people see that it's not a dark book, because everybody who has read it has said that. I think it's a great book for Christmas. You have the time to sit with yourself. It goes fast enough. People have read it in 24 hours and even in 2 days. So I would suggest you give this to anybody who is feeling literally sad, if not, if they haven't even been through abuse. So.
Thank you all. Thank you, Ritu. Thank you, Pallavi and Jenny, for sharing your most candid perspectives on being authors, writers, your travels, and of course, insights into your journeys as writers. Thanks so much, and look forward to more writing by all of you.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you.